You're listening to the Fan2Fan podcast, episode 8. On Saturday, May 14th, it was reported that comic book writer and artist Darwyn Cooke had passed away. The day before, on the Darwyn Cooke blog, Almost Darwyn Cooke, his wife, Marcia, had posted that it was, quote, with tremendous sadness that we announced that Darwyn is now receiving palliative care following a bout with aggressive cancer. And the day after, on the 14th, it was reported on the same blog that he'd passed away, along with a quote from John Kennedy's New Frontier speech, "Then we shall not be weary, then we shall prevail." It was a great loss for the comic book industry. Since then, there has been an outpouring of condolences and support for the family. There has been an industry-wide acknowledgement of the loss. DC and Marvel have both issued statements. Friends such as Jimmy Palmiotti, Gail Simone, and others have also made statements on social media talking about their personal loss as a friend and as a industry talent. Darwyn Cooke received a number of Eisner Awards, which are essentially the comic book industry version of the Oscars. He won 3 for The New Frontier. It was a limited series he did for DC Comics in 2005. He won a number of them for his Parker novel adaptations. So in total, he received 7. You can easily find his bibliography in a number of different places online, but I wanted to talk about Darwyn Cooke on a more personal note. In this episode, I was fortunate to have join me Marcuson Nassau. Marcuson is a comic book journalist. He's also a writer. He writes a comic book titled Voracious that debuted in February from Action Lab Comics. He's written for a number of different publications such as the Comic Book Journal, and that's actually where he interviewed Darwyn Cooke in October of 2007 for what's probably considered one of the more comprehensive interviews that Darwyn Cooke has done. They discussed everything from his childhood, his background in graphic design, in the fashion industry, in animation, all the way through his kind of return to comics. Marcuson was able to have a very in-depth discussion with Mr. Cooke. So Marcuson was kind enough to join me, and we were able to talk about the interview and just some reflections now that Darwyn Cooke has passed away. On a personal note, it was interesting how this has impacted me, because Darwyn Cooke was very much an inspiration in my artwork, in his philosophy, in his work ethic. He was from a different generation, a generation of folks that had a different work ethic. There was something very different about him that echoed to comic book legends like Kubert, Gil Kane, and Kirby. But for me, I lost my dad in July of 2015. It was very sudden, and having had some time to reflect on it and kind of go through the emotional spectrum, I know that I received a lot of my work ethic from my dad and have been able to use that in my creative endeavors, in the comics that I've done, and even in the creation of this podcast. And it's completely presumptuous to say, and I'll mention this in the interview slightly, but I really saw Darwyn Cooke as kind of my creative father, one of the few folks that has really spoken to me on a creative level that I could really relate to. When I discovered his work, specifically in New Frontier, it was at a time when I'd been drawing for a while, trying to break into the industry just like every other aspiring comics artist would like to, and no dice. It had not worked out. It wasn't in the cards at the time, and I wasn't sure where to go. I wasn't sure where my art style was. I wasn't completely committed to myself and what I wanted to do. I didn't feel like I had a voice. And then I discovered New Frontier, and I realized that here was this writer, this artist, who was doing it as one voice, and he was doing it incredibly well. He came from a very distinct perspective, a perspective that was all his own, and it gave me faith. It gave me faith to realize that if I found my voice, if I found how I wanted to communicate my work, it gave me faith to realize that I didn't have to hurry. I could find my voice, and if I did, that I could say something. I wish I had the opportunity to meet him, but through his work, through his legacy, I'll definitely keep pushing. And in those moments where I feel frustrated or I feel like it's not working, I'm just going to pull out a copy of New Frontier or his work on Jonah Hex or the Parker series. And I'll look at some of that work and be inspired and realize that I could probably try to get to 1% of what he did. And that would probably be pretty good. If you want to help and you feel like you want to donate, Darwyn Cooke died due to aggressive cancer. And as posted on the Almost Darwyn Cooke blog, the title was Fuck Cancer. And for anyone that's been affected by this awful, awful disease, if you want to help, you can donate to the Canadian Cancer Society at www.cancer.ca. His family actually set up a page where you can donate in Mr. Cooke's name. You can donate to the Hero Initiative at heroinitiative.org. They're a non-for-profit corporation that's dedicated strictly to helping comic book creators in need. They've helped a number of folks have a financial safety net for yesterday's creators, especially folks that have not necessarily earned what creators today earn, but have created characters that have become timeless. The Hero Initiative helps them out when they need emergency medical aid, financial support for the essentials of life, and helps them get an avenue back into paying work. If you want to own some original artwork by Darwyn Cooke, he's represented by Albert Moy, and you can find the amazing artwork at albertmoy.com. So before starting the episode, I would just set the tone with a quote, and it was from an article in 2012 from the LA Times where Darwyn Cooke was talking about before Watchmen, and he said, "I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I used to be a lot more romantically attached to really dark work, and I find as I get older, I'm looking for work that offers, for lack of a better word, hope." His work was very inspirational, it was very hopeful, and I am grateful that in the unfortunately short amount of time that he was around, he was able to make such a big impact on the industry, to his friends, to his family, and to me. Thank you, Darwyn Cooke, and you will be greatly missed. It was one of the interviews that stuck with me, and I thought, I don't know, you were able to get past the surface and help define Darwyn Cooke for me beyond the New Frontier, beyond his work. So again, thanks for making yourself available, but I just wanted to chat with you about him, especially since you were able to talk to him not just about his work, but also his life, his childhood, and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It was a real privilege to interview him.
So this was back in October 2007, and you were working as a freelance writer for the Comics Journal?
I was, yep.
Okay, and how did it come about that you were able to interview him?
Well, I was working for Silver Bullet Comic Books at the time, and I wrote the column All the Rage, which was a gossip column. But I wasn't very good at it because in order to get gossip, you had to kind of look around the internet and try to find the stories that kind of, impacted creators or the seedier stories. And I didn't like that part of it very much.
Does this go back to the stall conversation we were just having a few seconds ago before I hit record?
Yeah, except I never went to conventions. I just stayed at home. So no bathroom ambushes. So, I wanted to do the column because it was a way to talk about comic books. But anytime I would hear a rumor, I would end up contacting the creator because I just wanted to give him a heads up. Because it was something that you'd have to put in the column, but I wanted to give him a chance to say something before I did that. When I was writing the column one day, I came across Darwyn Cooke on some message boards talking about Frank Miller and just saying some derogatory things about him. So I contacted Darwyn and basically told him that, maybe he shouldn't be saying those kind of things on the message boards and that I probably had to put it in All the Rage. But, did he want to say anything, or was he interested in maybe just giving an apology? I just basically wanted to give him a way to clear the air and to make sure that it wasn't going to affect him negatively. And so he did. He wrote an apology, and we put it in the column. And then we just kind of became friends. We started talking a little bit, and I did a couple interviews with him. And then I think a few months later, I had done an interview with Carla Speed McNeil. That was my first Comics Journal interview. And that was a smaller one. It was only 20 pages instead of the 40 pages that I did with Darwyn. But the Comics Journal was interested in talking to Darwyn Cooke for the magazine. But he told them that he didn't want to do the interview unless I was the one that conducted it because of everything that had happened before. And so, of course, I agreed with it. And I was happy to do the interview. And that's how it came about.
Were you a fan of Darwyn Cooke's work before? I guess let's start with the forum commentary before that.
Yeah, I mean, I was a huge fan of his work very early on with Batman Ego. So he was already on my short list to do interviews with anyways. That's probably why I found his comments about Frank Miller, because I just loved going to, see his comments, to see what he would talk about his work, or just know everything about him. It was like that back in the day when I was really into comic books. I mean, I am now, but when you're first trying to find creators, even when the internet's starting to form, you just want to find out as much information as you can about them. And at the time, like, the Comics Journal was, a print magazine. Now it's all online. And there was Wizard was out at the time, I think. And so you had to scramble a little bit more to find information about the creators. And nowadays, it's instantaneous.
Yeah, no, I remember the times of Wizard. Then there was Hero magazine. And then there were, of course, the Comics Journal. But a lot of that has moved online, and social media, or at least the access to creators through social media, however you define access, that's kind of collapsed the ability to get information about the creators, let alone at least get in contact with them, even if it's a one-sided conversation. Mm-hmm. So you were able to reach out to Darwyn. He responds. He asks for you when it comes down to doing a more encompassing piece for the journal. How'd that feel?
I mean, it felt great. I mean, the reason I wanted to start working for the journal was because I was doing this rumor column, and I didn't like that. And I actually moved All the Rage more towards interviews, as I had done a bunch of interviews in there that were more meaningful. Like I interviewed Colleen Doran, for example, about all the troubles that she had, the sexist problems that she had in the comic books community. And so I wanted to do more of an in-depth discussion with creators. And so that's why I contacted the Comics Journal. So to have that kind of access to Darwyn Cooke and to talk to him about everything from his childhood to, dreaming about becoming a comic book writer and an artist, to all his great works, was amazing to me. I think that interview is the most comprehensive interview on Darwyn Cooke that we have, which is, an honor to me.
Outside of Tucker Stone, he did an interview in October, was it 2010? And it was after Cooke had released The Outfit. It kind of brought it up a few years, mostly talking about his work with Parker and with Donald Westlake and that estate. Mm-hmm. But you were able to delve into, I don't know, it was almost like a retrospective piece, talking about his childhood through his time as a graphic designer, art director, his work in the fashion industry, animation, of course, and then finding comics, leaving comics, and then coming back into comics back when he was 37. But yeah, you were able to kind of go through the entire spectrum up to the point where, was it New Frontier, the animated movie, had it come out just when you were doing the interview?
I don't think it had come out. I think it was announced, and he talked about like the development of it. I don't believe it came out yet. But yeah, I'd like to read that interview that you just mentioned, because it sounds like a good compliment to my own, because that stuff with the Parker books came after. I didn't get to talk to him about that stuff because in 2007 he hadn't started those yet.
After you were put in contact with him, since he wanted you to do the interview, how did you guys actually logistically do the interview? Is it by phone, email, a little bit of both?
It was by phone, mostly. I think the final questions we may have emailed, but most of it was by the phone because Darwyn wanted to do it that way, which I preferred too, because I think it just made the conversation more personal. Because there was a lot in there that, we would just talk about in our own lives and that didn't even make it into the interview.
Was it one conversation or was it multiple conversations?
It was multiple over weeks, a couple hours at a time. When Darwyn was available, when I was available, we did that. And then I think the last piece, now that I'm remembering it, I did email him like a few questions, maybe like 10 more questions at the end. But yeah, it was mostly over the phone.
Did you follow Darwyn Cooke after the interview?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I've read everything that he's done, with the exception of Twilight Children. And
Okay.
that trade just came out, a few days before he died. And so I was just waiting for that collection to come out. Yeah, he's a creator. I tend to follow creators, and he's a guy that I needed to have everything that he did, all his work.
How did you find out about his passing?
Well, I was actually in Kentucky for a funeral. My wife's grandfather had passed away. And, I believe I woke up that Saturday morning to the news that Darwyn Cooke had passed away, and we were just getting set to leave because we had been there for a week. So it was a pretty rough 7 days for me because, I felt strongly for my wife's family. And, I really loved her grandfather, who was a former fire chief and used to tell me all these great stories. And then Darwyn Cooke passes away, who also gave us so many great stories throughout his career. And, I don't think that I've ever been as affected by the death of a comic book creator as Darwyn Cooke. And I don't know if that's because I did this huge interview with him and got to talk to him so in depth, but I really feel the impact of that. It's a huge loss.
I'm right there with you. I mean, I've followed Cooke's work as early as when I first discovered New Frontier, and then I went back a bit to see some of his previous work. And since then, just like you, I've been following everything. I was able to pick up the Twilight Children, the trade when it came out, and just kind of devoured it. But like you said, I follow creators as well, and he was one of those folks that had such a strong voice that I couldn't help but, when he did all the covers for DC, it put a smile on my face to see that DC was involving him, not for one or two covers, but for their entire line. It was a matter of respect for what he could do and that feeling that he can convey and make, guys like me that are almost 40 smile just to see Alfred tucking Bruce Wayne to sleep in a chair, and that moment of seeing Batgirl on a motorcycle riding with police sirens in the background. It's just like it's just perfect archetypal.
Oh yeah, I mean those covers are absolutely breathtaking. I mean, I love the one where Aquaman is kissing Mera in the ocean waves. All the ones you mentioned are also incredible as well. But he just had an amazing ability to capture the essence of a character in a single image. There's not a lot of artists who just had that ability. And I think with all of his experience and being an animator, working on comics, being an art director, he was just able to give this kind of a retro yet modern sense to everything that he did, and a feeling that you would get from just looking at his characters. I mean, when you draw Wonder Woman, she's always smiling, it seems like. And do you see that with any other creators? I don't know. So he just gives you a feeling with the way he draws the characters, where he's just kind of taps into their core and then puts it out in this just stunning visual display. And he won the Eisner Award for Best Cover Artist in 2015 for that series of covers. And he won a lot of Eisner Awards, and rightly so, for his work, because it was arresting.
I'll continue my conversation with Marcuson in just 1 second. In the meantime, if you are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review. Just search for the Fan2Fan podcast, go under reviews, enter a star rating, or write a review if you have a second or two, and click send. That's how easy it is. I will greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
Reading your interview, there were two things that I'd pulled from it. So I'd always seen his work as retro, but when you guys were discussing how at the age of 20, he submits his first comic, and it's a first showcase for DC. And then it's not until 17 years later, when he's 37, that he's doing Ego. So in that time frame, he's working in the world of art direction in magazines and fashion, ends up, ironically enough, seeing an article through the Comic Book Journal for the Batman Adventures, the cartoon after it kind of did its revamp, works as a storyboarder for them. Mm-hmm. And you see his style, and it's a timeless, like you said, it gets to the character's core. Going through his work in animation, and when you guys spoke about the intro for Batman Beyond and how he essentially put it together working on his Mac with other artists like Kurt Gita and what have you. But for a guy who's known for a retro style, he was actually pretty technologically forward. And it's pretty interesting to think of him that way, and to think that it was a choice that he made in his art style.
Yeah, I mean, his approach was very modern. The way that he would lay out panels, the way that he would capture characters in a still image, it was just very modern. And I think it's because he had those influences, but yet his artwork harkened back to the past of the great creators like Jack Kirby, Alex Toth. So it was that mix, I think, that really made him original.
We all found comics in our own way. Most of us probably saw it when they were releasing it in the mass market at the shelves of a 7-Eleven, convenience store, gas station, what have you. And he came from a time when that was how you discovered comics. And then now we're very much in a world of the direct market, where we go to a comic shop, we have our pull list, subscribing to comics through Comixology, and they're delivered to us on Wednesdays. But his perspective, like you said, Toth, Kirby, Gil Kane, and then let alone his graphic design background, he was a guy who knew how to tell stories because he had the benefit of looking at all these different perspectives and putting them into his work.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a good way to describe, how well he did his work. He was a storyteller, and I think his time in animation taught him how to do that, because you do a lot of those storyboards and how you're going to lay out the episodes, and you could kind of see that in the way that he would do his own stories, the way he would lay it out, and the pacing, and the visuals. So even though he initially broke into comics, you mentioned DC Comics Talent Showcase number 19, which was his first work, but it was years and years later before he actually committed to comics and broke in. So I think that time that he spent doing some of these other artistic endeavors strengthened him and kind of forged the kind of art that he would deliver later in his career.
One of the best lines that I love in the interview that that you guys have is when he says, "I'm very goal-oriented when it comes to these kind of things," talking about his pursuit of comics and in general, where he continues, says, "Made a decision right then and there. I was not going into this at entry level. I came in as a writer-artist, so I had enough influence to decide what I was going to do and how I was going to do it." It just, since as a creator myself, it gives me that sense of pride, and also puts the little goosebumps on my arm to think, he has this sense of urgency. He's a storyteller with a perspective, but he had a perspective that he knew who he was. He wasn't, we see some creators, and this is beyond comics, where they're looking for their voice, they're searching for it, and it comes out through their art, through their work, whether it's music or comics or illustrations or what have you. And he's someone that was able to, like you said, kind of forge what that perspective was going to be. So by the time he came back to comics, he knew what he was about as a person. So when it came to his artwork, it was just a reflection of himself.
He really came to comics with that Batman Ego story, which is, I think it came out in 2000 or around there. He was a fully formed storyteller at that point. I think he progressed and grew with each subsequent work that he did, but he hit the ground running when he came into comics, and he seemed to come out of nowhere because unless you knew of his work in animation, you really didn't know who he was. So it was really impressive when he hit the scene with this style that just wasn't like anyone else's. And again, I think it might have been a good choice for him to wait longer to get into comic books. I don't know. I mean, he had decided after did you know the story? I can't remember if it was in the interview, but in the story, he probably put it in there. He just went to New York. He grew up in Canada. He just went to New York with some work, went to the DC offices and showed his stuff. And Julie Schwartz, who was the great editor at the time, basically bought that work on the spot. And so he was in the new showcase, number 19. But in order to work in comic books, he had to move to New York because at the time you didn't have the technology, you didn't have Dropbox, you didn't have FedEx, you didn't have all these things that make it easy for you to work in another state. And so he wasn't really ready to make that leap. He didn't really want to leave where he was. And so he just decided to go in a different direction. But I don't think he ever really stopped dreaming about being a comic book creator. And, later in life, when he was in his 30s and stuff, he had that itch. He felt like time was running out, that he had to go and make comics. And, he did. He tried again. And that's when he, broke in.
All the comics to break in with in Batman Ego. I mean, it's not when they go to every, isn't that like the creator question? Everyone has one good Batman story. What's yours? And everyone wants to use a member of Batman's rogues gallery and try to do something different, unique, and fun. And when you think about Darwyn Cooke's story in Ego, where he takes Bruce Wayne and makes him a separate persona as Batman, and then they get to have this conversation, what he called the mental environment. It's a pretty mature version of what would be a person's Batman story. Someone might have just like a fun adventure with the Joker or Croc or Penguin, but even using Joker and Robin in the story, he's able to kind of go to a deeper question and trying to figure out what is justice, how are the innocent affected when Bruce Wayne chooses to be Batman and chooses to act. It's just interesting to come out of the gate and to be known for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first story really just emphasized how layered his work is, how thoughtful he is, how nuanced, not just his artwork is, but how his writing is. And then that's a story that when he was in his 30s, he went back to the DC offices and he pitched that story, and nothing came of it at that time. And so he went back to animation. And then it was 4 years later that Mark Chiarello, who had become the art director at DC, basically found that pitch and called him up and said, "Do you want to do this?" And that's how Darwyn Cooke really got his start in comics.
So in the conversation that you guys had, because you mentioned there's a few things that maybe didn't make it in there. Is there something memorable about the interview that you can recollect from your conversation with him?
I mean, I just enjoyed laughing with him. He had this big, hearty laugh. And so, I think we talked about like television shows and, the things that he really enjoyed growing up with. And not necessarily influences, but I think things that he enjoyed. And so just getting to know the man, over the course of these conversations was something that I really appreciated. And, I didn't know how it would go, because you never know when you're doing interviews, how candid somebody's going to be. And, Darwyn was that. And I mean, just his generosity with his time. And, the one big thing I remember, and this definitely is in the interview, but the Comics Journal actually asked me to write a eulogy for him, which I just completed like right before this conversation. But what had happened is Darwyn and I did these interviews over a course of a few weeks, and the journal was getting ready to print it, and Darwyn did this great cover of Power Girl, where she's holding up a mirror to her boob window.
Sure, with the objects in the mirror look closer, right?
Yeah, I think it's objects in the mirror should grow up and move on.
Oh, very nice. Yes.
And I remember Darwyn actually, he told me about that idea, and he's like, "Do you think I should do this? Because I kind of want to do this." I'm like, "I think you should definitely go for that. That's amazing." And so I remember that, but after he had given me the cover and I sent it to the Comics Journal, they came back and they put the text over the cover. And so I sent that to Darwyn. I was like, "Hey, well, here's what the cover is going to look like with all the text on it." And they had put a blurb in there, a tagline that mentioned Darwyn pouring a beer over an editor's head, which is an event that we do talk about in the interview. But Darwyn, he objected to it being on the cover. So he called me and said, "We have to take this off. I just don't want that to be on the cover. I don't want to be known for that. I want to focus on the positive side of my work." And, I agreed with him because I did the interview because I just really admire his work. But at that stage, the interview was already at the printer. So I went to bat for him anyways. And, I talked to the Comics Journal, and they did change it, but it really strained my relationship with him. In fact, I didn't write for him after that. And just finishing this eulogy for Darwyn is the first time I've written for him since that interview, because I went to bat for him for that change on the cover. And he was so appreciative of it. And that's something, if you've read any of the tweets or articles or anything about Darwyn Cooke, everybody keeps talking about how kind and generous he was. And there's so many great stories. And that was true. Like, he said to me, he called me up. He's like, "I can't really thank you enough for doing this. And, if there's ever anything that I can do for you, you just call me anytime and I will be there for you." And it was almost like a magic wish to me, that he gave me. And, that's something that you felt that when you talked to Darwyn, that he had this fierce loyalty to people, that he would, be there for you, that he would, that he was just so kind to the people that he liked, or even people that he had just met. There's lots of stories about that. So yeah, I never cashed in on that favor because just having it was enough for me. But, if it was really magic and I could use it now, I'd wish that he was still here with us.
For all the stories about pouring a beer over an editor's head, or being quote unquote difficult to work with, in the interview where he talks about how he's he admits he's a romantic, and that one of his partners at the ad agency had said that he's burnt on one side and raw on the other. So, it's for what some people may say, "Oh, he's a curmudgeon, he's difficult to deal with." Maybe that's more editors and other folks that had to deal with his, very specific perspective, his storytelling style. But on the other side, you hear this outpouring of people that met him at conventions, and not just creatives and professionals in the industry, but folks that would, just talk to him and share their stories and how they discovered comics again or for the first time, particularly through New Frontier, and how generous he was sharing with them his love for comics, the industry. I think he loved comics. He loved the medium. And he even mentions in the interview you guys did how he could have easily just said, "You know what? I'm in the animation world. I'm in LA. I can just stay here." But he decided to pack his bags and go right back into the comics world.
Yeah, I mean, there was lots of stories of him being difficult, but I think a lot of it just had to do that he just cared so much about comics, and he cared about his own work so much that, he would have these feuds with people, and not just his own work. I know there were some artists that were close to him, and he would get on them to do the best work they could possibly do. And sometimes it would rub him the wrong way. But, he was really no nonsense when it came to that kind of stuff. And, if you didn't have a tough skin around him, I personally never met him, which which is horrible. I really wish I would have, but from what I hear, that's how he was like. And it wasn't because he was just being a dick. I mean, I'm sure sometimes he was, but I think it was just because he wanted to better himself and better the industry and better his peers around him.
He had just high aspirations for what comics could be. When he mentioned, when you guys were talking about the comics industry and comics going into TV and how there should almost be a guarantee that you're watching something like Smallville or now things like Arrow or Legends of Tomorrow, and there should almost be a 10-second at a minimum. He mentioned a commercial for the comics. It just becomes so commonsensical when you think about it. Well, why wouldn't we want to promote this? But everything is so siloed and so segmented that TV is one thing, movies are something else, comics are something else. And I think he just had such a passion for the medium, how he'd discover it and what he wanted it to be, that he just had high aspirations for it.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, I still wish that we would have advertisements for comics. You used to get them when you would watch cartoons. You'd have the toys. You'd have all this merchandise that related to the shows that you're watching. I mean, comics is the same thing. You can do that for adults or for children. So I don't really know why DC, Marvel, and some of the other companies don't really advertise comic books. Like, just put it at the end of the show. Like, you like this? Check out this book. I'm really actually surprised that they don't do more of that. I don't know if it's because it's like a communication issue between the Hollywood and the comics folks, or I don't know what the issue is, but he's absolutely right. There's lots of ways to try to bring comics out more. We have all these great movies, but they're based on even better comics. So, I would like to see more of a move towards getting people to read the books.
I'll conclude my conversation with Marcuson in a minute. In the meantime, remember you can find the Fan2Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN, or on Twitter at Fan2Fan podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so reach out, send a message, and let me know what you think of the show. Thanks. So you mentioned finishing writing his eulogy. How was that process?
It was tougher than I thought it was going to be. It definitely was. I mean, I mentioned, the story about him, telling me he'd do whatever he could for me after I had helped him. So, yeah, it was hard because you're just going through all of his works and, remembering all the great things he did. Remembering the conversation we had. I had totally forgotten that he asked me to do the interview. Like, he would not do the interview unless I did it. And so it was tough for me to do it and just do him justice. And they usually, hopefully, I have. So it's like 4,000 words. They told me to write 2,000. I wrote 4,000 because I needed to put as much as I could in there about him. But yeah, it was hard. I've written eulogies for my grandfather before. And, I have to say it was kind of like going through that, even though Darwyn and I were never close. I wouldn't say we were friends in life. But just his impact and what he meant to comics, and his incredible skill, passion, you see that in his work. And, that's in me just because I want to read comics and make comics. And so for those reasons, it was tough to do, but, I had to be done because he deserved it.
You get legends like Kubert who pass away. They've made such an impact in this industry, and Cooke did that beautiful tribute piece with Sergeant Rock and Easy Company kind of standing in the background, and the caption, I forgot what it was, but essentially just kind of admiring the fact that he was a mentor to him and think like a father figure. I'm right there with you. I don't know why it's different. I lost my dad last July, and
I'm really sorry to hear that, Bernie.
Oh no, and it's been long enough now where it's the initial impact of it. I have at least some perspective to think, okay, well, I know I got my work ethic from him, but it was interesting because that morning when I woke up on Saturday, and like you, I discovered that Cooke passed away. my wife immediately knew something was wrong. And it was, it's presumptuous to say that I always thought, you know what, if I ever meet Darwyn Cooke, I feel like we'd be kindred spirits because we could talk about Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia and Driver and all these, like the Friends of Eddie Coyle and all these shitty movies from like the 70s and 80s that maybe no one watches, but that there's just a special place in my heart for him. And maybe he and I could talk about this stuff and, some of this, the music conversation that you had with him in the interview. I mean, he was a music lover, from what we've talked about very briefly. You're obviously a music lover. So there was a depth to him where, like we were talking about, before I hit record, the idea that we go to these conventions and you mentioned in your recent experiences, you want that more human experience, just play Cards Against Humanity with other creators, have fun, chat with someone, get to know them as a person. And it seems like the folks who were lucky to know him as a person, they were impacted by him in that sense.
Oh, definitely. And I hear he was a terrific storyteller. And, there's lots of stories coming out now. I know Jimmy Palmiotti is writing stories for Bleeding Cool. He put one up about Darwyn, and he's going to keep putting more up there. So, he had a tremendous impact personally on a lot of people. And it wasn't even just comic book creators. I can't remember the name of the site now, but there was a podcaster, I think it's iFanboy actually. One of the co-founders there had become close with Darwyn Cooke.
That's right, because they did that interview with him. I saw it on YouTube where they spoke with him, and then there was another panel discussion where they were on a stage, and he was joking around with them as well. But that joking around that you can only have when you're comfortable with someone.
Yeah, and Darwyn asked them to do that panel with him, to moderate that panel, and he wouldn't do it unless all three of them went there. And he even offered to pay for their flights to go to the show. So that's the kind of stuff that he would do. Like, he just was fiercely devoted to the people that, that meant something to him, or he's just very appreciative of the industry and the people in it as a whole. So, there's so many great stories. Like Gail Simone put up a story where New Frontier had come out and she just loved it. And when New Frontier came out, it was not that well received. Like, people didn't really know what to do with it at first. After it finished, of course, it won all these awards and had this great acclaim. But Gail Simone loved it from the very beginning. And so she was writing about it wherever she could and like actually arguing with critics about it. And somehow Darwyn Cooke heard about this, and they were at a convention together, and he came up to her and I think he kissed her on the cheek and said, I really appreciate everything you said about it. It means so much to me. I have a gift for you. And then later he came up to her and he's like, you have to choose, Gail. And she's like, well, what are you talking about? And he had this sketch of Black Canary that he had drawn just for her. And he's like, you can have this sketch that I drew for you, or you can have any of these pages from New Frontier. And he had this book there for her to.
Was this the Sophie's Choice thing that she mentioned?
Exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm. So, he would go out of his way a lot of the time to be nice to people in the industry, even people he didn't even know that well.
Brian Michael Bendis had said on Twitter, the best way to celebrate the passing of an artist is to sit with their work and enjoy it one more time. Try Darwyn Cooke's New Frontier. You hope that folks discover Darwyn Cooke's work more and more and see it, not necessarily, for the retro nostalgic feel, but kind of looking at it as iconic. Was it the first chapter of New Frontier, Analog Heroes, where he kind of gives a nod to and an homage to the soldiers of old. Those were the heroes, and kind of paving the way for the capes that he didn't necessarily want to draw even from the beginning in his work in Showcase. And like you mentioned with Julie Schwartz, was it the person that he'd initially talked to, where they're like, hey, this guy's good, he just doesn't draw the capes.
It was another editor, I think, that had his work, but then that editor showed it to Julie Schwartz and was like, this guy's pretty good, what do you think? And then Julie Schwartz was like, oh, buy it. That's how that happened. But yeah, even in New Frontier, they have to work with the United States government, the military in that book. he had a sense of heroism, not just for superheroes, but for, all different kinds of characters. And that was reflected in his work. He wasn't just content with doing superheroes, he wanted to do other stories. There's that esoteric story in the Twilight Children. There's crime noir in the Parker books, and his art changed for those. He wanted to push himself and just do things in different genres. I think he ended up really enjoying superheroes and what he could say with them. He had a voice in a lot of different genres, and he was great at it. I mean, who knew? I mean, that first thing that he pitched for the showcase was I think it was like a detective story.
Yeah, it was like a 5-page story, and I don't think there were any words. And if I remember right, the editor is the guy who wrote the Batman story that had influenced Darwyn Cooke.
Oh,
early
right.
It was like, and it's the story that he eventually kind of remade when he did Solo. And I forget what the Batman story was, but it was something like Night of the Stalker or something along those lines, where Batman sees a family get killed, and now that boy's orphaned, so he goes after the folks, something that stuck with Cooke to the point where he ends up in front of the person who wrote it, who's basically going to bat with him, for him rather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I love that Solo book. Wow, that was really good. That's another one he won an Eisner Award for. Yeah, I mean, he was very versatile. He had a lot of influences like that, and he liked to pay his respects to things that had come before, which, added to his whole kind of retro look.
I'll say, did you see his solicitation when they solicited Revengeance?
No.
It was supposed to come out through Image, and it was in this, I think it was right between the last Slayground, the last Parker book, where it had the thing at the end, Park will return in 2015. When you mentioned the iFanboy in one of those interviews, they ask him, hey, so in the back of one of these books, it says Parker will return in 2015. He's like, oh, that was BS. He's like, that's not going to happen. But Revengeance was a creator-owned work that he would have done to take place in the mid-'80s in Canada, in his hometown, and it was supposed to be kind of like this psychological thriller with romance and humor and different elements in there, but just going to the point, like you mentioned, he was very versatile, loved different genres, could embrace them all, just very well-rounded.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's why he was perfect to write The Spirit, too, because Will Eisner put all of those different elements in there, noir, horror, romance, humor. And, he could do all of that stuff. When the Parker books come out, they're some of the best crime novels ever. And we have a lot of crime stuff in comics. And, here's a guy who hadn't really done that before. And then, you get those books and they were just absolutely perfect. So, and his artwork in those books is probably my favorite artwork that he's done. And the pacing of those books is amazing. So it's hard to choose. Like, everything he did really was flawless. I can't really. There's not a lot of nitpicking I had for his work. I was always excited when it came out, and when I read it, I was still excited. I was excited to see what he would do next, or what he would try next.
I just hope that other creators now, take the baton, are inspired to try to do that on their own. Whether it's, with DC or Marvel or as a creator-owned title, you just hope that they take some of that, the hope that he always talked about. Because even going back to that Dark Knight, was it The Dark Knight Strikes, where he had some thoughts about Frank Miller, and he'd mentioned in the interview you guys did about how things like Watchmen and Dark Knight had that grim, gritty tone, and I think the romantic part of him wanted to see at least a return to hope in comics.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see that even in something as simple as the covers that he did for DC. There's hope in the characters' faces, and it was an underlying factor for a lot of his work, especially New Frontier. Which basically played off JFK's speech. at the Democratic National Convention, his acceptance speech, where he's talking about the new frontier and like a cautious optimism, but a hope for what can come beyond. It was a perfect vehicle for that book and for a lot of his work after it. And, things don't always have to be grim and gritty. And I think people do get away from that now and again, like I think Mark Waid, his run on Daredevil. Daredevil was known as a really gritty book. In the beginning it wasn't. It was basically a Spider-Man clone. But then when Frank Miller took it over, it became a darker book. And, Mark Waid changed that and made it more of a lighthearted romp that still had, adult themes. And that's what Darwyn Cooke does too. It's like you read New Frontier and there's a lot in there about race and nationalism and fascism and all these things that are deeper. But then there's this like childhood sense of wonder, when you see them just battling an alien threat. When you see these superheroes, you see Wonder Woman smiling and the wonder of Hal Jordan in that book, or Martian Manhunter. And he just was really good at showing that side of it, showing this sense of hope and the characters and what they could do as heroes.
I'll say that's a great way to remember his work, the ever-smiling Wonder Woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. There's like very few images where she's just not grinning or just not happy. I think people struggle with Wonder Woman, like to write her or draw her. I don't know what the definitive Wonder Woman is. But to me, it's Darwyn Cooke's images of her. So he would always have like that hope that you said in his characters, but his books were all layered. There was so much to them. And I think it just takes a special kind of creator to be able to put all that stuff into each work.
Any final thoughts that you can think of on?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just say, just remember his work, reread his work, whenever you get a chance, let people know about it, because I know that it's going to endure. I know that people are going to find it and be influenced by it, especially the next generation of creators. But, you can learn a lot just from looking at his stuff. So if you're a comic book creator, or you're new to the industry, or you're just new to comics, Darwyn Cooke just made comics better with every single work that he did.
Someone said this. I'm not taking credit for this, but I think in one of the many outpourings for Darwyn Cooke, he made comics better and made better comics.
Yeah. So. Yeah, absolutely. And that's perfect.
That's it for this episode. Tune in next time for more Fan2Fan conversations on the Fan2Fan podcast. Thanks for listening.
With the swiftness of a deadly cosmic ray, the Earth is invaded by indestructible moon monsters. Their ghastly mission, death for all humans.